Good morning. 2 Samuel part 2 today. And if you thought that David's reign got off to a slightly ambiguous start, then it's going to get a whole lot worse today. So we're going to really have the account of the rest of David's life. He doesn't actually die in the book of Samuel. He dies at the beginning of the book of Kings, but this pretty much sees out the rest of his life now. So we're going to pick it up in 2 Samuel chapter 11. 2 Samuel chapter 11 is the story of David and Bathsheba. You almost certainly know it. It begins with David not going to war with his army. Now, we generally regard war as a bad thing, and so we might naturally tend to view that in a positive sense, but we're not intended to. It says this: in the spring, at the time when kings go off to war, David sent Joab out. We met Joab yesterday. He's kind of David's henchman, really. David sent Joab out with the king's army, but David stayed in Jerusalem. And this is an indictment because the king's responsibility was to be at the head of the army. So David is starting to get a bit complacent. He's starting to get a bit slack, quite honestly. And because he's swanning about, idling his time, rather than doing what he ought to be doing, he finds himself on the roof of his palace in the trying to get a bit of cool, and he sees a woman having a bath in the kind of the household that his palace overlooks. And there's lots of things we're not told in this story. We are not told, for example, if she knew she could be overseen. We're not told. We are told that she was purifying herself from her menstrual uncleanness. So we kind of have an idea of which part of her she was washing, but we're not told whether she was kind of having a voluptuous naked bath or whether she was just discreetly washing herself under her clothing. There's lots of things that we're not told. But what we do know is that David looked at this woman, who it turns out is the wife of one of his military commanders, the wife of one of his mighty men. And he desires this woman, and he sends for her and brings her to the palace, and he gets her pregnant. Let me just say one thing about that. Sometimes Bathsheba has been characterized as a seductress who who lures into sin this great king who is otherwise very morally pure. Well, we've seen already there were questions about his ethical conduct. We're going to see more questions around that as we go on. But one thing I would say is that the power imbalance here was astronomical. I mean, not only are women always weaker than men in this world, but this is a woman being summoned to the house of a king who has the power of life and death. And I cannot read this as anything but a rape. It may be what we would call a statutory rape, the sort of thing that's perhaps that's not quite the word I'm looking for, but the idea of a power imbalance that is so strong that she cannot have given meaningful consent. I'd be willing to go with that rather than a kind of violent rape. But nonetheless, I do think that this is undoubtedly an abuse of power. So David gets Bathsheba pregnant, and then the matter gets worse and worse, because once he discovers that she is pregnant, he then plots to get her husband murdered. First of all, he gets Uriah, that's the husband. He gets him back. He tries to get him to go and sleep with his wife so that David's actions will be covered up. But Uriah is a man of honour, and his fellow soldiers are fighting and risking and losing their lives on the battlefield, and there's no way he's going to go and indulge himself back at home while that's happening. And so despite David several times trying to get him drunk and trying to send him home to his wife, Uriah will not do it. He's too righteous. So in the end, David sends him back with a letter, which he takes to Joab, David's henchman, his what's the word I'm looking for? The kind of strong man who does the dirty work for somebody in power. He takes this letter to Joab, and the letter is to get Uriah killed in battle. And so Joab positions him in a particularly dangerous place, pulls back the troops, and surprise, surprise, Uriah dies. David thinks that he has managed to cover up his crime. He waits until Bathsheba has consoled herself a bit for her husband's death, and then he marries her, and all's going to be fine because now she'll be pregnant, and it'll apparently be a legitimate child, and so on. However, of course, God is not fooled, and God sends the prophet Nathan, again, we met him yesterday. God sends Nathan to tell David about his sin. Now, this is a really scary thing to do. I've said already, David is an absolute monarch. He has his word can bring life or death. And so Nathan has to bring this word. And so he does it in a particularly clever way. And he tells David a story. He tells David a story about a rich man with many, many sheep, who sees who has an unexpected visitor and ends up killing the one sheep owned by his neighbour in order to feed the visitor. And David's furious, he's indignant, and he says that man should die. And then in this glorious moment of Hebrew narrative, Nathan kind of looks him in the eye and says, "You are that man." And David, give him credit where credit's due, David is deeply repentant. When he realises that God has seen, when he realises the enormity of what he's done, he is deeply repentant. However, the child dies, but he does marry Bathsheba, and Bathsheba is subsequently gives birth to Solomon, who is going to be king after David. But we won't meet that story today. So that's the story of David and Bathsheba. Now, it is important for a number of reasons. It's important because it's a major moral failure of David, but it's also important because it is going to kind of repeat itself in the next generation, or something similar. So we move on to chapter 13, and we have one of David's sons called Amnon. And Amnon has conceived a great desire for his half-sister Tamar, another of David's children. And he takes advice from a friend who is evil, really, and the advice is, well, lure her into your room and then you can have your way with her. And so Amnon takes to his bed pretending to be sick, and David sends word, "Oh dear, what's the matter, Amnon? You know, what can we do to make you feel better?" And he says, "Tell you what make me feel better is if you sent my sister Tamar to my room to make some food in front of me and to feed me from her hand." And I don't know what David's thinking. In fact, I do think I do know what David's thinking, because the imagery here, the language here is quite clearly kind of a language of innuendo. And David sends his daughter to Amnon, and Amnon rapes her. And David does nothing about it. David is shown here as a very weak father. But in a sense, it is his own sin with Bathsheba kind of recurring, really, in this next generation. Tamar's brother, Absalom, is absolutely incandescent about this. Tamar goes to his house and spends the rest of her life in his house, a ruined woman, you know, a woman who has lost her virginity, even if through no fault of her own. A woman who has lost her virginity outside marriage is pretty much unmarriageable. And so she spends the rest of her life in Absalom's house, a ruined woman. It's very sad moment. But Absalom is incandescent with Amnon, and he plots and murders Amnon. At which point he then has to flee, because David is now angry with Absalom for killing Amnon. Oh, goodness me, what a mess. This is a dysfunctional family. That's chapter 13. In chapter 14, Absalom's been in kind of self-imposed exile for some time, and eventually David is persuaded to bring Absalom back. So Absalom is allowed to return to Jerusalem, but David still will not see him. He won't be reconciled with him. So the following chapter, Absalom now plots against the king, and we can see this whole thing is unravelling, and it's unravelling because actually of what David did with Bathsheba. That's the beginning of this whole unravelling of David's monarchy, really. So Absalom, David's son, plots against him. What happens is he kind of gathers together people who have a grievance and a grudge, and he says, "Oh, you won't get any justice from the king. Oh, if only I were king, I'd pay attention to a grievance like yours." And gradually he built up this following, and then he goes into open rebellion against David, and David actually has to flee from Jerusalem. And it's quite a poignant moment, actually, as David is departing in lamentation and grief, as Absalom has taken the throne. Then in the next couple of chapters, we get a series of people jostling for power around the young pretender, and around David, and gradually loyalties are kind of shifting between David and Absalom. And you can read some of those stories. There's one particular character I'll mention because we're going to meet him again later, a chap called Shimei in chapter 16. And as David is leaving Jerusalem in lamentation and weeping, going into exile, Shimei, who was of the house of Saul, he mocks David, and he kind of walks along beside him, throwing things at him and shouting at him and mocking him. Hold that thought, because we're going to encounter Shimei again. Then finally, the Absalomic rebellion is over in chapter 18. There is a battle victory in David's army, and in particular Joab again. There's that character we've mentioned before. He defeats Absalom. Absalom has very long, luxuriant hair. And when he's fleeing from Joab's army, he gets caught in a tree, and his hair gets caught, and he's kind of left dangling in this tree by his hair. And Joab comes upon him. Now, David has given very strict instructions. He wants Absalom defeated, but he does not want his son dead. And Joab happens upon Absalom hanging helplessly from this tree, and Joab murders Absalom. And so once again, we get this ambiguity where David benefits from this man's death and yet grieves very publicly. Chapter 18, David grieves very publicly for Absalom, and actually needs to be talked into kind of setting his grief aside and reclaiming the crown in a public way. So finally, he returns to Jerusalem, and all that power jostling that was shifting between David and Absalom now kind of rearranges itself as David consolidates himself once again on the throne. There's nothing clean or straightforward about David's reign from beginning to end, really. So that's chapters 18 to 19. And 20, we get another rebellion which is quashed. And then in 21 we get a nasty story of vengeance, and we get more wars happening against the Philistines this time. And then the final 3 chapters, we get kind of wrap up to David's reign, even though he doesn't actually die in this book. So in chapter 22, David sings a great song of praise. A psalm, really. You find it also in Psalm 18. David sings this song of praise, which is recorded in chapter 22. We get some kind of final words of David in chapter 23. We also get an account of his mighty warriors, a kind of a list of his mighty warriors. And then, having made his kind of final song and his final words, we get almost an appendix in chapter 24, where David conducts a census of the fighting men in his nation. And he's not allowed to do that. And the reason he's not allowed to do that is because, well, I think the reason is because God doesn't want people trusting in their military strength. He wants them to trust in him, in God. You may remember the story of Gideon, where God continually said to Gideon, your army is too big, trim it down, trim it down. And in the same sort of way, the idea of the census of the fighting men being forbidden, because if you can count your armies, and if you do count your armies, then you suddenly start relying on your own resources rather than on God. And David chooses to forget that, and he conducts a census of his fighting men. And as a result, judgment falls upon the land. It's always the way in the Hebrew Bible. One of the key ideas that is just assumed within the Hebrew Bible is that the leader, which is usually the king, but the leader of a nation, or sometimes the head of a household, if they do wrong, the whole of what they are head of, everyone that they govern, as it were, suffers. There is no perceived injustice in that. It's just the way the world is, and the writers of these ancient books understand that. As I am recording this video, I am very aware of stuff that is going on in the White House right now, which I think demonstrates exactly this in the same way. So as of these few days of recording, Donald Trump is saying that certain states which he regards as hostile to him will not receive the financial aid that they need to fight the coronavirus. He's also saying that certain states that are seeing an absolutely exponential growth in coronavirus cases, he's saying, I don't think you need as many ventilators as you're asking for. And here I'm seeing one man leading a nation, who leads a nation, and through his folly and through his complacency, his wickedness, actually, I think, many, many, many lives that he governs are going to come to grief. So we do see this, that the folly or the evil of the man in charge or the person in charge causes the whole nation or the whole of the people that are governed to suffer. That happens in chapter 24 here. David counts the fighting men, and as a consequence, evil comes upon the whole land. Eventually that is stopped. God turns it back and turns back the judgment, has mercy. And David, the concluding moment of this book is that David builds an altar in thanksgiving to God for turning back the judgment that has come upon the land because of his own actions. That brings us to the end of the books of Samuel, and tomorrow we'll pick up with the books of Kings.